Okay, so let's bring up Tom and Megan Wells now. Megan works for Two Birds Films. Tom, Technicians Films, but they've worked on some of the highest profile events. You may not realize it, but you might realize it after the talk that you've probably seen a lot of their work on events for like the World Series, the Super Bowl, the Olympics. They got some really cool stuff to talk you through on how to take live event production to the next level. So please welcome, we're very lucky to have them here, Tom and Megan Wells.
Table for two people. We'll try and take up the space.
All right. Everything's off to a good start because I'm thirsty. My mouth is dry, and I'm freezing, so this should go really well. Let's see. We got our first slide up. We realize that we are tackling a huge subject here today. Every organization, whether you're a broadcaster or a university, are going to have different capabilities and different goals, and we're not going to be able to give you a silver bullet to take your production to the next level, but we will open up the back end of this to a few Q&A, so you can throw some more specific questions at us that maybe are more succinct to your situation. Overall, what we're going to talk about, if we can advance to the next slide. Do we have a clicker up here, or am I just calling for it? There we go. Actually, we should have been on this one already. Let's fast forward again. So just really quickly, what we're going to go over here today is on this sheet, definition and understanding of just cinematic techniques. I just want to really get meta on that for a second and talk about it in brief detail. Then we'll talk about the storytelling machine. Meg will touch on that a bit, or your storytelling machine, whichever one you're a part of. We'll talk about a couple of real-world case studies, if you want to call them that. One is a project I've been involved with for like the last almost decade now, which is postseason and World Series. And then Meg has one that she'll touch on as well, Human Towers, which is, I believe you did that through Red Bull. And then we'll kind of combine those two on the back end, tips and tricks and Q&A, depending on our time. So let's go ahead and take the next slide. So cinematic techniques and storytelling are really one and the same. They go hand in hand. They're often thought of as separate things, but they're really there to support each other. As we dive in here today, we'll see that really the story is at the center of everything. I'm a DP by trade, so most people think that my job is to make pretty pictures, and it is to make pictures, but in the end, it's much more about the story. I have to understand a few things that I don't get to make decisions about in order for me to make the decisions that I need to be able to make, if that makes sense at all. But let's talk about what cinematic techniques aren't, or what cinematic doesn't mean. I think what cinematic doesn't mean, because it's a bit of a misnomer, it doesn't mean pretty pictures, and it doesn't mean that you're shooting on film. It doesn't mean that your program's of specific length. It doesn't have anything to do with the platform that you're distributing on, whether it's a film in a movie theater, a TV, or an OTT platform. Like, that's not what makes your image or your footage or your project cinematic. You know, you can have movies that are really pretty. You can have things that are pleasing to the eye. You can have a movie that's shot with beautiful landscapes, beautiful lighting, beautiful faces. But there are also films that are shot in black and white, that are shot with lighting techniques that aren't considered to be flattering. But they do communicate the story, and that's really what you're trying to do, is communicate story and emotion through the cinematic techniques that you have at your disposal. So just for fun, I looked up the definition of cinematic because I think that term gets thrown around a lot. So what do we mean when we talk about cinematic? This is from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So cinematic means relating to motion pictures. And then I thought, well, maybe that's not enough, so let's look at film. Film definition is a movie or a motion picture. And movie, okay, I thought, well, maybe we're talking about movies here when we talk about cinematic, and that was the closest thing that I could find, which it's cut off a little bit, but a story or event recorded by a camera as a set of moving images, or motion picture. So then we look to see what motion picture, and the definition is just another term for a movie. So you're like, all right, well, what does all of this mean in the end? Like, what are we talking about again? Cinematic techniques are, in the end, just tools in your toolbox that I think when we talk about them, we're thinking of a movie. And there are good movies and there's bad movies. And they're not, it doesn't have anything to do with pretty pictures or ugly pictures. It has to do with how the story was told. Good movies usually tell us a great story in a well, cohesive, thoughtfully, carefully put together way. And the cinematic techniques it uses are, they have to enhance the storyline and not detract from it. So let's forward on, here we go. When we talk about cinematic techniques, there's literally like thousands of them. So it's not about what's going on in the camera. It's all of these things you see on the screen and more. Some of these you're going to have control over in a live situation, and some things that you're not. Composition, as a DP, I can control the composition. I can control my depth of field and my frame rate. Some of these things are not going to be under my control. Maybe the lighting is not under my control every time. The casting certainly isn't under my control. I don't get to pick the teams that I want to cover. Locations aren't under my control, but there are certain things that are under my control, and what I have to do is start learning how do I manipulate or take advantage of those elements in order to communicate story and emotion, which in the end is all that we really care about doing. That is the definition of cinematic in the end. So how do we get these elements to work together? All of them have to come together in a way that's cohesive and well thought out. So as a DP, whether you're a DP or a director, or name your role in any of these events, whether it's a live event or a feature that you're putting together, you have to start backing up and asking yourself some questions in order to figure out which one of these tools you can use and how you're going to affect them. So stepping outside of your own desires and preferences is really important in that moment. And to do that, you have to get back to this idea of who you're working with and your team, which goes to the idea of the machine. If you'd like to pick up from there and talk about that a bit.
Yeah, perfect segue. Can we advance 2 slides, actually? That one. All right, so Tom was talking about kind of the tools in the toolkit, and something I think we both thought through a lot as we were prepping this conversation with you guys was this idea of universality. So the universality of experience. Everybody in this room is a content creator. Everybody's making something. Everybody's trying to put something out into the world. And it doesn't matter if you guys are working with the smallest budgets and the smallest teams, or we're working with big networks, we're streaming, we're doing a linear production. It is all part of a machine that's trying to achieve something, that storytelling machine. I love the little icons, just in case you don't see where I'm going with this on the slide. But so about the tools, the cinematic tools and the techniques, how do you know which ones to use? Which ones are the ones that are going to take your broadcast, your stream, your experience to a different place? You know, my background's as a director and as an EP, and from this perspective, I like to think in terms of the machine and understanding that we're all part of it in some way, shape, or form. Some of us are trying to figure out what the machine does. Some of us are trying to figure out the tools to get the machine to do what it needs. So every broadcaster, every OTT platform, every university, every content creator is part of that. But each one of your machines are going to be different because your machines are trying to achieve something that is unique and custom to what it is that your message, your brand, and your experience is all about. Maybe your machine has been told by the higher-ups that it needs to focus on athletes and their families, or maybe you've been told to focus on fans, or maybe your machine is intended to focus on recruitment. But every single one of you in this room is going to have a different initiative that your machine must work to satisfy. I'm just going to focus on that for a minute and repeat it. Every one of you is going to have a different initiative. So when we talk, or when Tom mentioned the silver bullet, we talk about the silver bullet. There should be no silver bullet that makes this work for every single one of you, because the minute you take the silver bullet and you apply that to everything you're doing is the minute you guys all start to look the same and you stop connecting emotionally in a different way with your audience. And I think that's really important to note from a storytelling perspective. Can we advance to the next one, please? If you want to connect with your audience in the right way, you have to know what it is that they want. And every audience is going to want something different. So it is not enough for you guys to just assume that your audience is interested in sports or a game. I think that that is a generalized assumption that is probably the baseline assumption that every one of us in this room kind of walks into the production with. It's a generalized understanding, but it's not enough, because every single audience that's watching wants something slightly different. So when I was mentioning the machine focusing on alumni groups or fans or recruitment, you know, there are wives and girlfriends, there are parents of athletes, there are former students, there's former professors and teachers. Those are all folks that are probably going to be engaged in your broadcast, but they're all going to want something different out of it. So if you use the same language and the same verbiage to talk to them, you're going to lose people because they're going to feel like it's too generalized. We like to use this phrase, reverse engineering, really taking a look on the front end before you even produce something, before you even create something, about who that audience is and what their needs are, so that you can reverse engineer content that's going to speak very specifically to them, and they're going to leave that experience feeling like they've had something custom, they've had something different. We all know that there's so much content out there, there's so much clutter, and the idea of cutting through is tremendously difficult in an oversaturated market. And the way that we do that as content creators is we try very, very hard to listen to what it is that our audience is asking for, reverse engineer what we're creating, and then hand it to them, because we're setting ourselves up for the best chance of success in that way. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. I started mentioning cutting through the clutter and what we're focusing on. I spent a lot of years working for Turner Sports, covering NBA, PGA, NASCAR. You do that week on week on week, just like what you guys are doing week on week on week. The experience gets to feel very similar. We used to make the joke at a certain point with NBA that it just becomes basketball, it just becomes sneaker squeaks and ball bounces at a certain point. The rivalries exist, the game drama exists, but from the audience and the viewer's perspective, it gets to be a little mundane and it gets to be a little repetitious after a while. So what is it that you're trying to do to make your broadcast different and your experience different beyond what's happening on the court, on the field, and the pitch, on the ice? So the game is always the game. That is the thing that's going to happen every broadcast that you have. But what are you creating around that experience? I heard a conversation earlier today about shoulder content, flanking content. We all call it something different. But are you creating content that leads into your live broadcast? Are you creating content that can be cut down and repurposed, that has a better ROI that you can use in multiple parts and pieces? Are you thinking through features? Are you thinking through camera angles that are different? Are you trying to search for the unicorn that is something that is going to be different and raise your broadcast to a different place, so that the idea isn't just, hey, we made a great broadcast about this game, because audiences can go to a lot of places to see games, and that experience is going to be pretty much the same. But are we thinking through, are we partnering with our DPs? Are we partnering with the folks who are creating and executing this content? When I talk about the machine, you know, there's the people that know what the machine is trying to do. So the machine is trying to talk to recruits. So I know as an EP and a director that I'm going to need to create content about the younger athletes. I'm going to need to create content about the guys who come in as freshmen and are sitting on the bench, that the recruits that are coming up into that system go, okay, that's going to be me. How is this going to be different for me? Why am I incentivized to go to this place to do this thing? Am I going to be able to tell features that speak to them? Am I going to be able to talk to my DP about looking for things that are unique and different in the moment, during the experience, prior to, that keeps fans engaged in a different way? We can go ahead and advance. This one is the most simple slide ever, if-then scenario. If you are trying to create customization, if you are trying to talk to a certain audience, if you are trying to do something different, this is something I run through my teams with prior to creating anything, whether it's going to be a live experience, shoulder content, flanking, or a feature. What is it that we're trying to do? Who is it that we're trying to talk to? And let's backtrack and reverse all of that. So if we are talking to audience X, then what are we doing to engage them that is different? If there's a takeaway I can leave with you, here is the one that I would like you to walk out of the room of. Think about the if-then scenarios. Think about the techniques that Tom was talking about. Think about the tools and the tricks that you can use to make your broadcast and your experience different. So creating that emotional engagement, it's special and lasting. It's the thing that's going to create a bond with your audience. It's going to create the numbers. It's going to create the viewers. It's going to create the thing that keeps them coming back because they're going to get something different. They're going to get, this is going to give audiences a reason to choose you instead of somebody else. So that is a brief overview about kind of the storytelling from an EP and director's perspective. Hopefully that talks a little bit about what story you tell. How you tell it is another matter, and that's where that dialogue that Tom was talking about between EP and director, or DP and cinematographer has to take place. To get back to that machine analogy, the one partner knows what the machine needs to do. The other one knows who it needs to talk to and how that needs to happen, and that circuitry is critical, that conversation between those two so that we aren't running rogue, so that my ideas and his ideas aren't completely misaligned and that we're pulling on the same string to create the best scenario in the end. And that's my elegant pitch back.
Let's fast forward to the next slide. As I mentioned, I've been working on the World Series for a number of years, and we've seen that production evolve. And so I just want to use that. It's probably something that most of you are familiar with. And there's a lot of little nuggets in there. But really, regardless of what project you're working on, again, I'll go back to point out the fact that I'm a DP and we're talking about cinematic techniques and the idea of pretty pictures versus ugly pictures versus really just where do you point your camera and then where does that footage go when it's all said and done. Again, just that's sort of where my framework is all the time. And so once hopefully as a DP your organization has gone through this alignment process that Meg's touched on, you can start making some decisions about what your role is and how you cover it. But regardless, you're going to still have some traditions in place. So let's take a look at baseball. So baseball is a very traditional game. The viewers expect baseball to be presented to them in a fairly cut and dry sort of way, at least traditionally. I mean, people get angry. You go online and check the forums, you know this. Like, anytime there's a glitch in the broadcast or something changes or like they've included a new piece of technology, there's always a love-hate thing with it. So as a DP, you're sort of faced, and really all of us, you're faced with how much can I push the envelope here and not make somebody angry and still give people something that's usable. Because, and I've been told time and time again out in the field, you know, if it's not going to make air, don't shoot it. Like, stop wasting your time. We send you out to go do, you know, shoot scenics, and you come back with 3 times as much stuff that we need, and that was a cool shot, but where do we use it? How do we use it? In a lot of those situations, I'm faced with the question, well, I wish somebody would tell me where this was being used, because then I would know how to shoot it. You know, if I'm in a location, how do I know that what's happening over here on the left isn't really super important to a story that's being told tonight? As a DP, I don't necessarily know every piece of the game. I can't follow every team. That's not my role. I don't follow stories of every team. If we're in the playoffs and there's a half dozen, 8, 10, 12 teams in contention, I can't possibly track with all of those storylines. So I'm constantly having to go back and say, what are we talking about here? Just talk to me like I'm a child, because it's important for me to know who are the key players here tonight versus last night. Who are the key players going into the games next week? Who are we going to be looking for shots of the day before? Not just you know, I try not to walk into a game and then just become a reactive force. So when we started World Series, sorry, quick time check. When we started World Series like 10 years ago, or not when I started World Series, about 10 years ago, we were shooting on tape-based cameras, like Varicams, if that. We had an EVS system in the truck. And so the game, if you look at the historically where we were, the game was being broadcast in its current state, and we were brought in as a very typical E&G crew that's there to shoot stuff from the sidelines and shoot pregame and grab an interview when it's needed, and then everybody else will figure out how to use this stuff later on in post. As we moved into like the first year or two, it was right when Canon sort of released the 5D, and suddenly we had a new little tool at our disposal. Because prior to that, we were still sort of faced with our traditional broadcast tools, like, again, tape. The lenses that we were using were news lenses. They were E&G lenses from, you know, years before. We had a hard time even getting a piece of HD glass for a while. But that 5D opened up a lot of creative abilities. We could shoot shallow depth of field. We could shoot large format. We could shoot low light. We could shoot in tiny little places that we had never fit before. And so we immediately started trying to figure out, okay, well, this is cool. We have a new little tool we can use, but how do we integrate it? You can't just integrate it across the board. You have to find a way to integrate these tools so that they're effective and safe. We're not going to take a 5D and show the pitcher live during the game, right? So how do you, where are the moments that you can take the tools that this new piece of equipment gives you, which again, to get really meta here, shallow depth of field, low light capability, and a new range of lenses that we didn't have access to, and use those in ways that are effective. I can't make all those decisions. I have to send that stuff back up the line to our directors, the producers, and essentially kind of show them what we can do. So we took those 5Ds out, we shot everything with our regular cameras that we could, and then we started to integrate those in and send footage up the line. Once the directors and the producers and everybody got a hold of that, they started to figure out how they could integrate it. Suddenly the messaging and the direction started coming back to us. We started getting more creative input from our directors and our producers. So then we were then able to begin this conversation that prior to that we didn't really have access to, because we all had the same tools and there was nothing really new to play with. The 5Ds were not, we couldn't integrate those in every potential situation to help tell our story a little better. So eventually we got the F55. The F55 was a large format camera, obviously, large sensor camera. We could put cinema lenses on it. It opened up our options even more. We sort of moved from that to the Arri Alexa and Reds, because what happened was basically we could send back a higher quality image. We could send back better footage. We could send back new footage. We could send back things that they hadn't seen before. And then the guys in our trucks on the back end started to realize that they could do things with it that they hadn't done before. But it didn't happen. It didn't click until we became a cohesive unit. Until we started having a conversation the morning before, or the night after of the game, to talk, to sort of brief and debrief. Our game really didn't elevate itself at all. And it took, it's taken, 8, 9 years to get to the point where we are now, where we feel like we have a really cohesive unit. And that's the beauty of what you guys are working with for the most part. Like, you have an organization where you're working together day in and day out. You can coordinate. You can figure out what your messaging is, and you can start to have the conversation. It's really, again, we can go into a lot of specifics on these techniques, but there is just no silver bullet that's going to help elevate your game. A rising tide raises all ships, as they say. So have the conversation with your directors if you're a DP. If you're a DP, have the conversation with your producers, and have those conversations with anybody that you can on your team. time goes by faster than you think it does when you're up here. I would say that the overall, the most effective thing that we have done in our live broadcast is introduced the digital cinema unit. It's a generic term that's being thrown around now, but the live digital cinema unit, which is a freelance camera that's running around that can capture stories that are not focused on what the live game's focused on. So you've got every live camera pointed at your game, at a player, at the team. You've probably got 20 shots, 15 shots that you're sort of constantly switching back and forth between. I just challenge you to start pointing the camera in a different direction, essentially. If you integrate just one or two cameras that are more free, that aren't tied to the game, that aren't dedicated to having to focus on anything, and allow them to take some risks, it will open up the footage that's coming back to you on the back end in a way that you probably don't expect. And for that, you're going to have a little bit of trust in your crews. You will have to give them a few pointers on the stories that you're going to be wanting to focus on. But it's really a reciprocating relationship. I apologize for running on there. Let me pass the mic back over to my colleague here and see if...
I'll take the torch for the next case study. If we could advance, please. Actually, two, if you wouldn't mind. So I wanted to bring as a case study a really strange and random one, something that maybe you guys wouldn't expect. When you look at these images, is anyone in the room familiar with this, by the way, before I go in through? Show of hands, anyone? Yes, at least 5 people. This is probably one of the most niche live broadcast events that Red Bull Global puts on through their OTT platform. This is a live broadcast that happens every 2 years. It is a sports event, the Human Towers of Catalonia, or the Castiliers. I'm butchering the pronunciation of that, but it is a live arena event that is broadcast in the same way that a basketball or a hockey game would be broadcast. And the challenge that Red Bull gave my unit, I was the EP of the flanking content unit, was how the heck do we get anyone to understand this, number one? How the heck do we get anyone interested? And how do we get more than 5 viewers who are all sitting in the Catalan region of Spain to watch this broadcast? Not really a super difficult or not a super dissimilar problem than most sports broadcasters and producers face. How do we get people to watch? How do we get people to understand? How do we get people to engage? Go ahead and forward the slide if you wouldn't mind. So we understood that the live broadcast, the game is the game is the game. As I said earlier, the live broadcast was going to deploy all the same techniques, all the same camera placements as we would have for any other live sports event. So we had to do something different in order to engage an audience and get them interested in this. And I'm going to fly through this just because I know we're running short on time. So if you guys have questions later and want to hear more about human tower building, hit me up. So Red Bull said, you know, when I talk about the machine and what the machine is trying to do, Red Bull said to us, hey, we want to talk to these other audiences. We know that we're going to have this super niche audience, which for you guys is going to be, like in a lot of scenarios, that's going to be the families, the athletes, the parents, the alumni. Like that's the niche audience that you get. But if you want more than that, if you want a broader scope, if you want to talk to more people, who are those people? So Red Bull put this on the table. Arts, music, and culture as a demographic, science and innovation, lifestyle and culture, because I repeated that, and history of the game as themes and audiences. We knew that you know, people who are interested in music might not be interested in sport, but we had to build that bridge. We had to try and find a way to do that. So what we did is we produced a whole bunch of flanking content or shoulder content to air in advance of the live broadcast that we knew that we could cut down into features, bumps, roll-ins, roll-outs, use during the broadcast, and then bring talent that we had during those features and those programs onto the desk to be able to commentate and speak in and to add color and to add something different into the broadcast. As we talked through this, we thought, okay, we know what the broadcast is going to look like because it's not going to look that different than a sports broadcast. So how do we differentiate this content? And we had a conversation, the creative team and the production team had a conversation. What cameras are we using? What lenses are we using? Do we choose lenses that are going to look vastly different than what the live broadcast is going to look like, so that the viewer understands this is additional content. This is the unicorn they're getting that they wouldn't get elsewhere. Thinking through what it's going to look like, how it's going to feel, what those stories are. If you're going to tell a science story to try and talk to a demographic that might not be interested in the live broadcast, how are you going to pull them in? Well, maybe you talk about the science of the human body, what happens to people when they climb on top of each other, or when they play on the court, they play on the ice. What's happening to their bones, their musculature, their heart rate? What's happening to them mentally? What challenges are they facing? How is that different? Do you get an orthopedic surgeon? Do you get a psychiatrist? Do you get a trainer? Like, who is it that you're talking to? Who are the protagonists? And then how do they pull into the live broadcast as a result? So what we did is we wound up producing stories around art, music, and culture. The history of the sport with a little bit of comedy, so people who didn't understand what the heck was happening when people were crawling on top of each other kind of got that. We pulled our talent on, and they took us in and out of break in a lot of scenarios in addition to the commentators. And we were able to differentiate the content and drive them to the platform and keep them engaged in a different way. I flew through that, so hopefully we can get to Q&A, but if any of that didn't make sense or you want to hear more about it, please talk to me afterwards. We can advance the slide. We can keep going.
Yeah, all right. I think in the interest of time, because we have run to the end of our allotted time, so if there are questions from the audience, or I will let the powers that be tell us whether or not we have time to take a couple. Take one or two? Okay.
So they better be really good ones, no pressure.
So just a quick question is, how do those conversations go with producers when you're trying to push the envelope when it comes to using gear that they might not be familiar with or that they're used to using? And what kind of prep do you put into it when choosing that gear that you want to pitch to them to use?
I mean, I would say that there's like, I have well, as a DP, I try to say I don't have a style because I always want to be flexible and be able to match whatever my director or client wants me to or needs me to do. But the conversations are usually just like really casual, to be honest with you. I usually wait to hear what the assignments are, and I start a little bit of muscle memory. I mean, go back to what's hung you up in the past and simply look at and go, okay, where are the red flags here in this production, and start asking questions. And when people don't have the answer to those things that you think they should have an answer to, that's where you push a little bit harder. And then I think in those moments where you don't ever have an answer that's handed down to you, that's when you start making creative decisions for yourself. And you have to make educated decisions. You still have to go back and kind of know, like, what are we doing here? Is this, and I'll throw out some, well, I don't want to throw out any brands because I don't want to label anybody, but there are broadcasters who say this is very traditional, cut and dry. We do not change anything here. There's a room we do the interviews in for this event, and it is a way we light it, and there's a way it looks, and that is it. And nothing else is changing. Like, we are by the book. And then there are clients who say, we just want to wow people and shock them, and we want them to see something different. And if they're not seeing something different and new, then we're failing at our job. So then I make those decisions in the moment, like, okay, this is what the client wants. They're not going to be angry if I take a chance and fail, because what they're going to be angry about is if I don't take a chance. And, long term, that doesn't work for them. So then you start kind of having those independent conversations with yourself, like, yeah. I hope that answers. Any other questions? See a hand back there? In the back wall?
So I teach a sports broadcasting class at our university, and it's an elective in the digital cinema major. So I actually have sort of the opposite problem of a lot of kids who come in, they know the RE and they know the Reds, and I'm trying to teach them more the broadcasting side of it. Do you have any tips or tricks when it comes to trying to have them think a little bit more in the live side versus the creative and sort of post-production side?
I mean, again, going back to what story you're telling. I mean, I don't mean to just, beat that one to death. But if you're showing the live game, you can't take so many chances, because when the person, scores, like, you want to have them in focus. You want to be able to see what's going on around them. You need to have the shot a little bit wider. You need, like, there's certain things that you need to do that might not be considered sexy in the moment because it's not on a red with shot at a T1.3 and, but it doesn't need to be. Like, and how to convince them to like it, I don't know. Like, if they want to shoot the art on the side and be independent, then that's what they're going to want to do. But I think, in terms of the story, like, if your team wins and you haven't done your part right, how does anybody know? I mean, like, that is what you're doing. You're broadcasting the game in that situation. You're showing them a score, you're showing them the play, you're showing them the action. You want a deep depth of field, and you want to, you want to see what's happening. And sometimes that doesn't feel sexy. But even when you start shooting, like, super shallow depth of field and just shooting what you want on the side, that can become a bit monotonous as well over time. Like, you're just shooting tight faces with nothing behind them. Like, where's that being used? When you see it put together in the end and it's finally shown in that final product, that's where it's exciting. Like, when you're shooting it, it doesn't feel like anything. It just feels like another shot. But I don't know how to make them. I'm sorry. Graduate them, give them an A. I don't know. Probably better. Yeah.
Sure, this has been great. Really
Okay.
appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.